La nuit où le destroyer américain USS Hobson DD-464 maintenait sa position au sein du convoi HX-233, les conditions maritimes étaient telles que la mer ne paraissait que noire et agitée. Le vent formait des stries blanches sur les vagues, et les embruns frappèrent les fenêtres, alors que la lune n'éclairait plus la scène maritime. La lumière à bord provenait principalement de l'affichage du radar et des ampoules tamisées, alors que l'Atlantique s'étendait en une obscurité totale au-delà des cloisons. Le capitaine Harold J. Mika notait dans son journal privé l'inquiétude persistante de ne pas apercevoir l'ennemi malgré des signaux sonars indiquant des contacts intermittents sous l'eau, vraisemblablement des cavitations de sous-marins allemands, trop délibérés pour être confondus avec des baleines. Au printemps de 1943, les Alliés, malgré la croissance de leur convoi maritime et des avancées technologiques en matière de radar, se trouvaient en grande partie dans l'ignorance face à la menace des U-boats allemands. Ces derniers utilisaient le radar METOX pour détecter les signaux radars alliés et pouvaient s'approcher des convois en toute discrétion, tirant avant même que les escortes puissent avertir. Les attaques nocturnes furent surnommées les massacres de minuit par les Britanniques. Le sonar de l'époque, connu sous le nom d'ASDIC, s'avérait inefficace face aux manœuvres des sous-marins en immersion profonde ou à cause des couches thermiques à la surface. Le radar SG américain, tout juste développé, était censé détecter un sous-marin jusqu'à plusieurs miles, mais se heurtait souvent à la turbulence de la mer et à des signaux déformés. Les opérateurs radars devenaient cyniques, n'étant pas en mesure de distinguer les fausses alertes des véritables menaces. Ce duel technologique entre les forces alliées et les U-boats, se concentrant sur la guerre électronique plutôt que sur la puissance de feu, s'intensifia. La tension culmina lorsque le sonar du Hobson signala un contact à 1200 yards, mais ce dernier disparut avant que le destroyer ne puisse confirmer la menace. À l'aube, le convoi était resté indemne malgré les alertes, ayant largué des charges de profondeur qui n'avaient pas causé de destruction confirmée. En préparant son rapport officiel lors du ravitaillement à Argentia, Mika exprimait succinctement la frustration d'un ennemi qui avait su échapper sous le couvert de l'obscurité. Cette situation, bien que montrant une avancée technologique des Alliés, mettait en exergue un vrai problème de perception au cœur des opérations navales, illustrant une lutte qui allait bien au-delà du courage ou de l'effort. De tels rapports résonnaient à travers les archives alliées, témoignant des défis constants dans la détection et la lutte contre la puissance des sous-marins allemands. L'océan agissait comme un terrain de tromperie durant la Seconde Guerre mondiale, avec un accent particulier sur l'interprétation des données radars par les sous-marins. Dans un mémorandum du 12 avril 1943, le commandant I.R.M. Jones a suggéré que, bien que les radars puissent détecter les U-boats, les retours étaient noyés dans le bruit marin. Il a proposé de manipuler les réflexions radars pour tromper les sous-marins afin de les faire apparaître. Cette suggestion, bien que modeste, a donné naissance à ce que les destroyers appelaient le hack radar fou. Le hack n'était pas un appareil, mais une stratégie d'exploitation des faiblesses du radar. Les U-boats, dotés de détecteurs sensibles à certaines fréquences, pouvaient être trompés si un radar allié modulait sa fréquence ou émettait des signaux imitant le bruit de la mer, créant ainsi des échos fantômes. Ces échos indésirables trompaient les sous-marins, leur faisant croire à la présence de plusieurs bateaux, ce qui les poussait à changer de cap ou à faire surface, permettant aux destroyers de les repérer. Au printemps 1943, cette méthode circulait de manière informelle parmi les unités radars britanniques et américaines, avec des récits attribuant son origine à des observations à bord du HMS Duke of York ou à des découvertes par le Naval Research Laboratory. Officiellement, elle était appelée contre-mesure radar type 271X, mais dans les salles des officiers, elle était connue sous le nom de signal fantôme. Le capitaine Mika, alors en maintenance à Boston, a été briefé sur cette méthode par le lieutenant-commandant Garnett, qui a décrit comment elle pouvait rendre les U-boats visibles. Bien que sceptique, Mika comprit que cette technologie permettrait d'utiliser le radar non seulement comme un outil de détection, mais aussi comme un appât. Cet échange marqua le début de la doctrine de chasse nocturne, passant de la détection passive à une stratégie de tromperie active. À l'été 1943, des destroyers furent équipés de nouveaux ensembles radars SG, permettant des variations de pulse, et les équipages s'entraînèrent à identifier les blips signalant un U-boat. Pour la première fois, le radar devenait non seulement un outil d'observation, mais également un moyen d'attirer les ennemis. Cette transformation, inconcevable en avril, allait bouleverser la guerre à venir. L'équipage du Hobson, en attente d'action, ignorait qu'ils allaient bientôt combattre des fantômes réels qui deviendraient mortels pour les sous-marins en chasse. Dans l'été de 1943, la bataille de l'Atlantique était dans une phase délicate, où les Alliés avaient maîtrisé la survie, mais manquaient encore de domination. Bien que les convois vers la Grande-Bretagne se faisaient plus fréquents, la traversée du Puits Noir, une zone dangereuse au-delà de la portée des avions, restait périlleuse. Les sous-marins allemands y frappaient avec une grande efficacité. C'est dans ce climat de désespoir que des ingénieurs de l'amirauté britannique, dont le lieutenant-commandant Arthur Arty Mroy, ont commencé à innover. Mroy, ancien professeur de physique et entré dans l'armée en 1940, était frustré par le rythme lent des décisions stratégiques, alors que les sous-marins semblaient avoir l'initiative. Sous la direction du commandant Permis, chef du développement radar, Mroy a proposé des expérimentations en direct sur des destroyers. Son idée révolutionnaire consistait à modifier délibérément les fréquences de transmission radar afin de tromper les détecteurs ennemis. Cela s'est concrétisé en juin 1943, lorsque le HMS Tumult a été équipé d'un radar expérimental. Mroy, embarqué à bord sous couvert de technicien, a pu créer un signal radar délibérément brouillé, imitant le bruit naturel de l'océan. À mesure que Tumult naviguait vers le convoi JW-57 à destination de Mourmansk, Mroy tenait un journal dans lequel il notait l'absence de détection radar allemande pendant plusieurs heures et la proximité inhabituelle des U-boats à la surface. Bien que ces observations aient été d'abord considérées comme circonstancielles, elles ont plus tard été corroborées par d'autres rapports américains opérant dans la même région, suggérant une réussite significative de cette innovation de Mroy dans la guerre électronique. Le USS Buckley DE-51 a signalé une rencontre avec un sous-marin non identifié qui a émergé à moins de 1500 yards durant la nuit, apparemment inconscient des faisceaux radars approchant jusqu'à ce qu'il soit trop tard. L'escorteur destroyer l'a heurté et coulé après un bref combat. Lorsque ces rapports ont atteint Haslamir, Mroy s'est senti justifié et a rédigé une circulaire confidentielle sur l'incitation à l'exposition des U-boats par modulation de pulse avec seulement 8 copies imprimées, dont une a été envoyée au Naval Research Laboratory à Washington. La réponse du commandant Ralph Bowen a confirmé des effets similaires notés par les opérateurs radar SG américains lorsque leurs équipements dysfonctionnaient à basse tension, suggérant que certaines failles pourraient être exploitées. Cependant, cette idée a suscité des réserves, de nombreux membres de la Royal Navy étant sceptiques face à des méthodes non quantifiables. En août, Mroy a rejoint une délégation au Naval Research Laboratory, où il a rencontré le physicien Dr Luis Alvarez, qui étudiait le brouillage radar pour les bombardiers. Ensemble, ils ont expérimenté des séquences de pulses sur des unités METOX, générant des résultats rudimentaires mais prometteurs. La fluctuation des pulses entraînait une réaction chaotique des récepteurs METOX, forçant les opérateurs radar allemands à éteindre leurs appareils pour préserver leur audition. Cela a conduit à la classification de leur découverte comme le Project Hornpipe, testé en secret par quelques destroyers. Mroy a exprimé des inquiétudes quant à la nature illusoire de ces méthodes, alors que le premier essai de combat, l'opération Nightstalk, était déjà prévu. Le convoi HX-255 est parti d'Halifax, transportant des marchandises essentielles pour la survie de la Grande-Bretagne, escorté par des destroyers et des corvettes. Mroy, en tant qu'observateur technique, avait fabriqué un dispositif Hornpipe connecté au radar. Lors d'un contact radar, il a déclenché la modulation, provoquant une interférence qui devait brouiller les récepteurs allemands. Après des heures d'attente, un opérateur radar a signalé un contact, entraînant l'équipage dans une anticipation intense alors qu'il se préparait à intercepter le sous-marin détecté. Le texte décrit une série d'événements liés à l'utilisation tactique de la radar dans la guerre navale, mettant en lumière l'innovation de Mroy et son équipe pour créer un champ de bruit océanique synthétique destiné à tromper et perturber les opérations des U-boats allemands. Un contact radar inattendu avec des U-boats incite Denholm à ordonner une attaque, confirmant la capacité de détection avec des résultats de tests ultérieurs, menant l'amirauté à examiner l'efficacité de cette stratégie. Tandis que des messages Enigma décryptés révèlent les difficultés rencontrées par les Allemands avec les interférences des signaux britanniques, Moreuil prend note des implications psychologiques sur les équipages allemands, soulignant que le doute généré par des informations erronées peut être dévastateur. Cependant, la réaction des officiers navals est partagée, oscillant entre scepticisme et approbation, ce qui conduit à une commande pour des essais ultérieurs en conditions de combat. Les événements culminent alors que les convois sont plongés dans un environnement maritime difficile, préparant le terrain pour de nouveaux essais de la technologie avant le jour J. Moreuil défend son approche innovante en insistant sur l'importance de la perception et de la psychologie dans la guerre sous-marine, un point qui semble résonner auprès de certains officiers, tout en mettant en évidence la menace d'une adaptation allemande face aux nouvelles tactiques. In the context of World War II, the classified technology Ghost Pulse, or Type 271X, played a pivotal role in the Atlantic naval battles. Its existence was closely guarded, with operational manuals securely stored and crew members sworn to secrecy. By early 1944, the German U-boat command was facing severe challenges due to advancements in Allied radar technology, which compromised their operational effectiveness. Intercepts of German communications highlighted their desperation, suggesting a retreat to safer routes. The turning point came with the HMS Hesperus encountering a German wolf pack. Utilizing the modified Ghost Pulse, the destroyer executed a response that caused significant confusion among the enemy's sensors, leading to the destruction of 2 U-boats. This incident exemplified the effectiveness of Moreuil's radar modulation, which altered the balance of power in the Atlantic, with subsequent reports indicating that Allied convoy losses had dramatically decreased. By April 1944, the operational landscape had transformed. Allied convoys navigated with newfound confidence, and the U-boat threat had diminished, though not completely eradicated. In the aftermath, Moreuil, reflecting on his contributions to this advancement, acknowledged that history might overlook the true extent of the developments, reducing them to mere technical improvements. As preparations for the Normandy invasion intensified, the German U-boat command under Admiral Dönitz initiated countermeasures to mimic Allied radar signals. This newfound capability was evidenced by an incident involving the HMS Cotswold, where the crew observed a false echo, precisely replicating their own radar emissions, indicating that the Germans had adapted to the Ghost Pulse technology. This evolution in tactics signified that while Allied technology had changed the warfare dynamics, the German response demonstrated their resilience and ability to innovate under pressure. The struggle continued, marking a relentless and complex interaction between detection and deception on the high seas. We taught them to see phantoms. Now they're building their own. Purvis sighed. Can we counter it? Not immediately, but we can confuse their copy. If they reflect our signal, we'll distort it further, make their feedback useless. Thus began Operation Whistler, an emergency program to upgrade the Ghost Pulse modulation into an adaptive system. Engineers experimented with variable pulse lengths, chaotic phase drift, and even the injection of random noise to mask the true radar signature. It was crude, unstable, and deadly to anyone who miscalibrated it. By July 1944, 2 destroyers, the USS England and HMS Havelock, tested the system against returning wolf packs near the Azores. The results were uneven but astonishing. In a debriefing preserved in the Air Force Historical Research Agency's archives, Lieutenant Robert Hart of the England reported, "Our set went wild for 10 minutes, then locked onto a real contact at 3,000 rendezvous. U-boat surfaced without warning, decks awash as if they thought they were safe. We never fired a shot. The boat exploded on its own. Suspected internal detonation, perhaps panic. Whether panic or error, the encounter proved one thing. The Germans were cracking under invisible pressure." Meanwhile, at Kiel, Oberleutnant Dietkummel of the U-1009 wrote in his log, recovered after the war, "Our METOX replaced by Naxos receiver, still impossible to tell real from false echoes. Sometimes the noise sings like a heartbeat. I no longer trust the machine. It lies worse than a man." By midsummer, Allied intelligence intercepted another BDU directive. Surface radar detection unreliable. Crews to rely on visual lookouts. Use radar sparingly. The irony was bitter. The German Navy, once proud of its scientific edge, had been forced back to the oldest weapon of all, human sight. That August, Mulroy stood on the pier at Greenock, Scotland, watching as a battered U-boat U-765 was towed in by a British tug. Her conning tower was shattered, her periscope bent like a reed. Inside, the crew had surrendered without a fight. He boarded the wreck personally, ducking under the narrow hatch. The air inside was foul oil, sweat and rust. In the radio room, he found a Naxos receiver half melted by fire. Next to it, a notebook filled with German shorthand. He couldn't read it, but one line stood out, underlined in pencil. "The night hums, the destroyers sing to us. Then come the explosions." Mulroy closed the book, his throat tight. When he returned to shore, Purvis met him with a simple question. "Have we won?" Mulroy looked back at the wreck. "We've silenced them," he said. "That's not quite the same thing." By late August 1944, with the Normandy invasion secured and Allied air patrols blanketing the Atlantic, the Great U-Boat War was effectively over. Only isolated submarines remained at sea, hunted relentlessly until they either surrendered or vanished. The once secret crazy radar hack that began in the dim radar shacks of 1943 had evolved into a global network of deception. Signals that could lie, mimic and confuse across half the ocean. Yet amid the triumph, Mulroy couldn't shake one thought. Each improvement, each manipulation of the invisible spectrum, made warfare less about courage and more about illusion. He wrote in his notebook before returning to London, "The sea no longer fights fair. Neither do we. Perhaps that's why we're winning." He never filed that note officially. But decades later, when it was found among his papers in a faded envelope marked Private 1944, historians would call it the most honest summary of the electronic war ever written. The Atlantic had grown quieter by autumn 1944. Convoys steamed without fear now, their lights glinting faintly against calm seas. Radar pings no longer meant panic, but routine. The escorts, once stretched thin and sleepless, now carried themselves with the easy confidence of hunters who knew the night belonged to them. Yet in that silence, men like Commander Harold Mulroy found no comfort. From his cramped office in Portsmouth, he watched reports trickle in. Enemy contact minimal. Convoy reached destination unopposed. U-boat activity negligible. Each was a line of triumph and a weight. The system he'd helped birth. The ghost pulse had rendered the ocean almost sterile of conflict. But Mulroy wasn't the sort of man who mistook quiet for peace. One cold evening in October 1944, he joined a returning convoy aboard HMS Mountie. The destroyer's radar operator, a young Welshman named Owen, was barely 20. He'd grown up never knowing the fear of the early Atlantic years, the wolf packs, the blackouts, the long nights when sonar pings could mean death. Mulroy stood behind him in the dim radar shack. "Strange, isn't it?" he murmured. "How easy it looks now," Owen smiled faintly. "Feels like we've tamed the sea, sir." "Tamed?" Mulroy repeated, eyes on the green glowing screen. "That's what they said about the air after we built airplanes. Then someone dropped a bomb from one." Owen didn't answer. Outside, the waves hissed against the hull. Far below that same sea, in a flooded bunker beneath Kiel, the remnants of the German radar command worked in desperation. Allied bombers roared overhead nightly, and their latest invention, H2S radar, rendered even the clouds treacherous. The scientists knew they couldn't reverse the tide. Still, one engineer, Dr. Wolfgang Ryer, scrawled in his lab book, "We began by seeking to see farther. We end by trying to hide from our own inventions." It was the same paradox Mulroy faced from the other side of the war. The more clearly they saw, the more inhuman the battlefield became. In November, a message arrived at Portsmouth from the Admiralty. Effective immediately, all radar deception projects to be integrated under Combined Communications Board. Ghost Pulse to be classified top secret. No public disclosure. Mulroy understood why. To reveal that Allied ships had not merely detected U-boats but deceived them, turned the Atlantic into a hall of mirrors, would have invited moral questions no one wanted to ask during victory parades. He signed the final report, locked it in a steel case, and turned the key. That night in his quarters, he wrote one last private entry. "We won not by sight or steel, but by convincing the enemy to trust the wrong sound. We spoke in echoes until they believed the ocean itself was lying. Perhaps it still is." By early 1945, as Germany collapsed on land, the few remaining U-boats surfaced to surrender. Most were rusted ghosts themselves, their radar gear smashed, their captains weary beyond speech. One such surrender occurred off Bergen in March 1945. The escort ship HMS Calder intercepted Utano 24. Her captain, Kapitänleutnant Hans Kruger, offered Moroi his binoculars as a gesture of surrender. "They no longer see true," Kruger said in English, tapping his temple. "Your machines, they made us doubt the sea, the stars, even our own ears. That is a worse defeat than death." Moroi took the binoculars but said nothing. When the war ended 2 months later, Ghost Pulse vanished into classified archives. Radar would go on to become the language of airports, weather forecasts and satellites. But its first voice had been born in darkness, whispering lies across the Atlantic. For those who had served in its shadow, the sea would never sound the same again. Years later, Moroi returned to that same coast. The destroyers were gone, the bases quiet. But when the wind blew over the surf, it still carried that faint rhythmic hum like an echo from somewhere deep and unseen, and he could almost believe the ocean remembered. The war was over, but its frequencies still haunted the air. Across Europe, disbanded radar sites flickered aimlessly on foggy hillsides, their operators gone, their dishes rusting in the salt wind. The technology that had saved convoys and doomed U-boats was now being dismantled, classified and reborn in a new world, already preparing for its next invisible conflict. Commander Harold Moroi returned to Portsmouth, a changed man. The Admiralty's laboratories were filled now not with wartime engineers, but with young physicists, clean uniforms, and polished instruments. They worked on radar for airliners, weather prediction, and peacetime navigation. Yet in a locked cabinet in the basement under the label CW42GP protocol lay the original Ghost Pulse diagrams, the crazy hack that had fooled the Atlantic itself. Moroi often visited that cabinet when no one was watching. He'd trace his fingers along the binder's metal spine, recalling the smell of the radar shack aboard HMS Mountie, the hum of the cathode tube, the distant thunder of the sea. To most it was a technical curiosity, an obsolete deception method superseded by modern systems. To him it was something more dangerous, proof that the human mind could rewrite the rules of perception. In early 1946, the Allied investigation boards met in London to compile a complete record of U-boat losses. The data was staggering. Between January 1943 and May 1945, 631 U-boats had been destroyed, more than half by surface ships using radar guidance. The Night, once the U-boat's strongest ally, had become a death trap. At one session, a U.S. Navy analyst named Captain Robert Wilkins presented his findings from the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey Naval Section. "Our conclusion," he told the room, "is that radar deception contributed not only to kill rates, but to the psychological collapse of the U-boat fleet. Commanders ceased to trust their instruments. They surfaced when they should have dived. They ran silent when they should have fought." He paused, flipping a page. It wasn't just what the Allies saw. It was what the Germans thought we could see. The room fell quiet. Across the table, Moroi exhaled slowly. He had never wanted credit, only understanding. Yet hearing those words spoken aloud felt like a confession the ocean itself had waited to make. Post-war intelligence reports from the Allied translator and interpreter section ATIS reinforced what Moroi and Wilkins suspected. Interrogations of captured German officers revealed an extraordinary pattern of paranoia. From the transcript of Kapitänleutnant Ernst Solar, recorded July 1945. At night we would hear the radar crackle. The indicator would show faint blips, then vanish. But when we turned, the destroyers were already there. It was as though they knew our bearing before we did. We thought perhaps they could hear our thoughts. From another Oberleutnant Karl Becker, the Atlantic was alive. We would turn off the set to escape the noise, but the noise was inside us. These testimonies, collected and cross-referenced with Allied intercept logs, revealed the scale of psychological warfare that Ghost Pulse had unleashed. For the first time in history, technology had been used not only to see the enemy, but to deceive his perception of reality itself. By 1950, as Cold War tensions deepened, the Ghost Pulse research resurfaced under new names. American and British scientists collaborated on Project Echo, the first radar-based communication system to bounce signals off the moon. The irony wasn't lost on Moroi. What had once been a weapon for hunting submarines was now being used to speak to the stars. Still, the secrecy remained. In classified meetings between the Admiralty and the U.S. Office of Naval Research, Ghost Pulse was cited as the first example of signal conditioning for tactical misdirection. The principle became the seed for modern electronic countermeasures, jamming, spoofing, and radar stealth. The hack that had once fooled in the Atlantic was now teaching nations how to vanish entirely from the radar screen. In 1962, nearly 20 years after those dark nights off the Azores, Roy received an invitation to the U.S. Naval Aviation History Symposium in Honolulu. It was a reunion of sorts. Scientists, veterans, and engineers gathered to discuss the evolution of wartime technology. Many of them were young men during the war. Now they were professors, directors, and consultants for emerging aerospace industries. Roy, white-haired but still sharp-eyed, took the stage on the final day. His talk was titled, "Illusions in the Fog, the Human Side of Radar." He spoke softly, deliberately. "When we built radar, we thought we were building eyes for machines. In truth, we built mirrors for men. What we learned at sea was that perception is the most fragile weapon of all." He paused, glancing toward a row of American engineers seated near the front. "We didn't win the night by force. We won it by distortion, by teaching our enemies to mistrust their own senses." When the session ended, a young American physicist approached him. "Commander Roy," he said, bowing slightly, "I read about your Ghost Pulse. Was it real?" Roy smiled faintly. "Real enough to save convoys, unreal enough to make the ocean doubt itself." The man nodded slowly, as if weighing that sentence against his own work in the new field of electronic surveillance. That evening, on the balcony of his hotel overlooking the Pacific, Roy lit a cigarette and watched the horizon fade to darkness. The sea was calm, the air warm. Below him, radar dishes at Pearl Harbor swept slowly back and forth, their beams tracing invisible paths through the humid air. He thought of the men he'd known, Captain Ryland, still haunted by the first U-boat his ship had tricked into surfacing, young Owen, whose trembling hands had once controlled the beam that sealed an enemy's fate. He thought of Kruger, the German captain, who'd said surrendering his eyes was worse than surrendering his ship. Some nights Roy still heard the echoes, the soft rhythmic hum of pulses rolling across the Atlantic, bouncing back faintly from the years. In his final memoir, published privately in 1965 and never released to the public, Roy wrote, "It was never about invention nor even about victory. It was about understanding that the sea is not an enemy, and neither is the dark. We created a light that blinded both sides, and in doing so, we learned that truth and illusion are separated by nothing more than a wave of static." Today, historians studying declassified files at the National Archives and the Naval History and Heritage Command can trace the full arc of the Ghost Pulse operation from its first field test in 1943 to its silent influence on Cold War, radar and stealth technology. "See?"